She thought she could be invisible in that gilded ballroom, a woman armed only with desperation. But in a world of power, there is no hiding, not from a man like Stephen Morris. He wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature, a vortex of control she had dared to defy. And when his shadow fell over her, his voice a chilling whisper in her ear, Ava knew her gamble for survival had just become a dangerous contract with desire itself, a desire she could no longer ignore. If this story of a dangerous bargain and an undeniable spark has already captured your imagination, subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and become a member for early access to the next chapters. Now, we'd love to know, what city are you listening from tonight? The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of money and lilies, a cloying combination that clung to the back of Ava Johnson's throat. She stood near a marble pillar, a ghost in a borrowed sapphire gown, trying to look like she belonged among the city's elite. Every clink of crystal, every burst of practiced laughter was a reminder that she was an imposter in this gilded cage, a florist who spent her days with soil under her nails, not diamonds around her neck. This was a world of calculated smiles and silent, brutal judgments, and she was fluent in neither language. She took a slow, deliberate sip of champagne she couldn't afford, the bubbles a faint sting on her tongue. Her gaze drifted across the room, a sea of silk and tailored suits, until it snagged on him. Stephen Morris. Even from a distance, he was a vortex, pulling all light and attention toward himself. He moved with a predatory stillness, his presence a low hum of power that vibrated through the polished floor. Men twice his age deferred to him with a slight bow to head, and women watched with a mixture of fear and fascination, their eyes following his every move. Ava had heard the stories, of course. The ruthless CEO who had inherited a crumbling empire and forged it into a global titan before his 30th birthday. They said he had ice in his veins and a mind like a steel trap, a man who saw the world not in colors, but in assets and liabilities. He was everything she wasn't. Powerful, wealthy, and utterly in control. A profound, instinctual need to remain unseen washed over her, a defense mechanism honed by years of living on the periphery of a world that was designed to crush people like her. And so, she did the one thing no one else in the room would dare to do. She looked away. Deliberately, she turned her back to the center of the universe, focusing instead on a wilting orchid in a nearby arrangement, its delicate petals beginning to curl and brown. She traced its fading beauty with her eyes, finding a strange comfort in its quiet imperfection. It was real, at least, more real than the flawless, brittle smiles that surrounded her. It was a small act of rebellion, a silent declaration that she would not be another moth drawn to his dangerous, all-consuming flame. But power, she was learning, has its own gravity. The low murmur of the crowd around her seemed to dip, the air growing still and heavy with unspoken anticipation. A shadow fell over her. She felt a presence behind her, so close the warmth of his body seemed to seep through the thin fabric of her dress. The clean, sharp scent of ozone after a storm and expensive filled her senses, eclipsing the cloying sweetness of the lilies. He hadn't made a sound, but she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was him. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the ballroom's noise like a shard of glass, a low, intimate whisper meant only for her. It curled into her ear, a chilling secret in a room full of strangers, raising the fine hairs on her arms and sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The words were precise, audacious, and utterly insane, a command wrapped in the guise of a proposition, and they landed with the force of physical blow, stealing the very breath from her lungs. He whispered, "Tonight, you're my fake fiancé." And in the deafening silence of her own mind, she felt the world stop turning. Before Ava could process the sheer absurdity of his statement, his hand was on her elbow. His touch was not forceful, yet was unyielding, a firm, possessive grip that guided her from the relative anonymity of the pillar and through a pair of glass doors onto a secluded balcony. The sudden rush of cool night air was a shock, clearing her head for a fleeting moment. Below them, the city sprawled out like a blanket of scattered diamonds, a breathtaking vista of power and ambition that she had only ever seen from afar, from the other side of the river. He released her, turning to lean against the cold marble balustrade, the city lights carving his profile into sharp, intimidating lines. He wasn't looking at her, but at the sprawling metropolis he so clearly commanded. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. Ava's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She finally found her voice, though it came out as a breathless, indignant whisper. "What did you just say to me? Who do you think you are?" Stefan finally turned his gaze on her, and his blue eyes were even more unsettling up close. They were the color of a winter sky, intelligent and startlingly perceptive, as if they could see right through the borrowed dress and into the tangled mess of her debts and worries. "My name is Stephen Morris," he said, his voice a low, even cadence that held no room for argument. "And tonight, you are going to be the woman I intend to marry. You will smile, you will look at me with adoration, and you will not say a word unless I tell you to." The sheer arrogance of it all sent a wave of heat through her. "You're insane," she managed, clutching her small handbag as if it were a shield. "I don't know you. I'm not doing anything. Find some other socialite to play your games with." She made a move to leave, to return to the ballroom and lose herself in the crowd, but his next words stopped her cold, rooting her to the spot more effectively than any physical restraint could have. "I know who you are, Ava Johnson," he said softly, and the sound of her name on his lips was a violation. "I know about your family's bookstore, the Blooming Quill. I know about the predatory loans your father took out before he passed, and I know the final payment is due in 72 hours, a payment you cannot make." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, dismantling her defenses one by one, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable under the vast, indifferent sky. He pushed himself off the balustrade and took a step closer. The space between them crackled with a strange, unnerving energy. "There's a man in that room, Mr. Saito, who is considering a merger that would define my company's future for the next decade. He is a traditionalist. He values stability, family, loyalty. He needs to see that I am a man who is building a life, not just an empire. You will help me show him that." He was so close now she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the only sign of a crack in his formidable facade. Then came the offer, delivered with the same cool detachment as a business transaction. $250,000, he said, the number hanging in the air, seeming to shimmer with the city lights. "It will be in your account by sunrise. Enough to save your family's legacy and secure your future. All for one night of your time. One night of pretending to be mine." He held her gaze, his piercing blue eyes searching hers, waiting for the inevitable surrender he already knew was coming. She had to choose between the price of her dignity and the cost of her dreams. The moments that followed felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly brief. Ava's mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of panic and pragmatism. The bookstore was more than just a building. It was her father's legacy, the scent of old paper and fresh coffee, her last tangible connection to him. The thought of losing it, of seeing his life's work shuttered and sold to the highest bidder, was a physical ache in her chest. This man, this cold, calculating billionaire, was offering her a lifeline. A devil's bargain, perhaps, but a lifeline nonetheless. "Yes," she breathed, the word barely audible over the distant city hum. The word tasted like ash in her mouth, a bitter pill surrender, a flicker of something, not quite triumph, but perhaps grim satisfaction, passed through Stefan's eyes before being extinguished. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, as if her answer had been a foregone conclusion. The deal was struck. The slow burn of humiliation began to creep up her neck, a hot, shameful blush. Without another word, he reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He didn't produce a contract or a pen, but a small, velvet box. He opened it, and even in the dim light of the balcony, the ring inside seemed to steal the starlight. It was an obscenely large diamond, an emerald cut, flanked by smaller stones on platinum band. It was elegant, flawless, and completely cold. It felt less like a symbol of love, and more like a beautiful, glittering handcuff. "Your left hand," he commanded softly. Hesitantly, she extended her hand. Her fingers trembled as he took them in his. His skin was warm, his grip surprisingly gentle as he slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The weight of it was immediate and immense, a constant, chilling reminder of the lies she was about to embody. Our story is simple, he murmured, his voice low as he continued to hold her hand, his thumb brushing against her knuckles in a gesture that was almost certainly part of the act. We met 6 months ago through a mutual acquaintance. A whirlwind romance. I proposed last week on my yacht. You are an art curator, specializing in botanical installations. He was creating a new identity for her, draping it over her like a cloak, and she had no choice but to wear it. You are shy, but deeply in love, he continued, his blue eyes locking with hers, forcing her to hold his gaze. When you look at me, you will see your future. When I touch you, you will lean into it. Do you understand? He wasn't asking. He was instructing. He was directing a scene, and she was his lead actress, cast in a role she never auditioned for. With his hand still holding hers, he placed his other on the small of her back, a gesture that was both possessive and strangely steadying. The warmth of his palm seeped through the thin silk of her gown, a point of heat that seemed to anchor her spinning thoughts. He guided her back toward the glass doors, back toward the glittering ballroom where their audience awaited. The murmur of the party grew louder, a wave of sound about to crash over them. "It's time," he said, his voice a low vibration against her back. As they stepped across the threshold, back into the suffocating warmth and light of the gala, she felt the shift immediately. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Whispers erupted like sparks in their wake. She was no longer Ava Johnson, the invisible florist. She was a woman on Stephen Morris's arm, a mystery, an enigma, a sudden and shocking fixture in a solitary universe. The weight of 100 pairs of eyes felt like a physical force, pressing down on her. She wondered which was a bigger lie, the diamond on her finger or the calm of her own racing heart. The moment they re-entered the ballroom, the atmosphere around them shifted palpably. It was as if a spotlight had been switched on, isolating them in its intense, unforgiving glare. Stefan's hand remained firmly on the small of her back, a proprietary anchor in a swirling sea of curiosity. He navigated the crowd with an effortless grace, parting the sea of socialites and power brokers, as if by divine right. Ava kept her eyes fixed slightly downward, focusing on the intricate pattern of the marble floor. Yet she could feel the stares, the dissecting glances, the silent, urgent questions rippling through the room. Stefan, a voice like gravel cut through the murmur. A stout, older man with a perfectly manicured white beard and shrewd, dark eyes approached them. His suit was impeccably tailored, his smile a carefully constructed artifice. Ava recognized him from the business pages. This was Mr. Saito, the linchpin of Stefan's ambitions. His gaze slid from Stefan to Ava, lingering on the diamond on her finger, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second. "Kenji," Stefan's voice was smooth, betraying none of the tension Ava felt radiating from him. "There was a matter of great importance I had to attend to." He turned his body slightly, a subtle, protective gesture that brought Ava more fully into his orbit. He looked down at her, and for a moment, the icy command in his eyes was replaced by a simulated warmth that was shockingly convincing. "I'd like to introduce you to my fiancée, Ava Johnson." He said the word fiancé with a soft possessiveness that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. Ava's heart leaped into her throat. This was her first test. She lifted her head, summoning a shy, hesitant smile she had practiced 1,000 times in the mirror for difficult customers. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Saito," she said, her voice softer than she intended, but it fit the persona he had crafted for her. She extended her hand, and Mr. Saito took it, his grip dry and firm. His eyes, however, remained on Stefan, searching for any crack in his composure. "The pleasure is all mine," Mr. Saito replied, his gaze finally returning to her. "Stefan is not a man known for whirlwind romances. You must be a very special woman." There was a subtle challenge in his tone, a hint of suspicion that made the fine hairs on Ava's arm stand on end. She felt Stefan's hand tighten ever so slightly on her back, a silent command to hold steady. This was a chess match, and she was a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She tilted her head, allowing a soft blush, partly real, partly feigned, to rise in her cheeks. "He has a way of being very persuasive," she murmured, glancing up at Stefan through her lashes, injecting a breathy, adoring quality into her voice. It was a line straight out of a romance novel, but in this hyper-real setting, It seemed to land perfectly. A low chuckle rumbled in Stefan's chest, and he squeezed her hand, playing his part to perfection. "That I do," he said, his eyes holding hers. Mr. Saito watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. He gave a curt nod, a subtle concession in their silent battle. "Indeed. Well, my sincerest congratulations to you both." He turned his attention back to business, but the intensity of the interrogation had passed. Ava felt a wave of relief, so profound her knees almost buckled. She had survived. She had played her part. But as Stefan guided her away, she caught the lingering, speculative look in Mr. Sato's eyes and knew this was only the opening move. She had won the scene, but she feared she was losing a small piece of herself in the process. An hour later, which felt like a lifetime, Stefan decided they had made their point. With a final, polite excuse, he was guiding her away from the thinning crowds and toward a private elevator tucked away in a quiet corridor. The moment the burnished bronze doors slid shut, encasing them in a small, silent box, the mask of the doting fiancé dropped from his face. He released her, stepped into the opposite side of the elevator, and the space between them suddenly felt vast and cold. He loosened his black tie with a sharp tug, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Ava leaned her head back against the cool, mirrored wall, the ornate pattern of the ballroom carpet still imprinted on her vision. Her entire body ached with tension she hadn't been aware of holding. The adrenaline that had fueled her performance was draining away, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion and the bitter taste of her complicity. She looked at her hand, at the foreign sparkle of the diamond that had felt so heavy all night. It was a beautiful lie, and it was starting to burn. "You did well," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth he had feigned so expertly. He wasn't looking at her, but at his reflection in the mirrored door, his expression grim. It wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment, a performance review. Saito is a cautious man. He bought the illusion for now. The cold, transactional nature of his words pricked at her fragile composure, reminding her that to him, she was just another asset, a tool to be used and evaluated. A spark of defiance flickered within her. "I'm not one of your employees, Mr. Morris," she said, her voice quiet but firm. And that was an illusion. That was a lie. She slid the ring off her finger, the metal cool against her skin. The absence of its weight was both a relief and a strange sort of loss. She held it out to him, the diamond catching the dim elevator light. "Here, the night is over. You can transfer the money, and we can pretend this never happened." He finally turned to look at her, his winter sky eyes meeting hers in the reflection. He didn't take the ring. "The night is not over," he stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Saito will have his people looking into you by morning. They'll find the bookstore, the debt. For this to be convincing, the illusion must be maintained for at least the next 48 hours, until the ink is dry on the contract." He saw the protest forming on her lips and cut her off before she could speak. "The original terms still stand," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "This is simply an extension of your duties." He took a step closer, and the confined space of the elevator seemed to shrink. "You will stay with me at my penthouse. We will be seen together tomorrow. We will maintain the narrative. It is the only way this works." He was trapping her, weaving the threads of his deception tighter around her, and she could feel her control slipping away. The elevator chimed softly, and the door slid open, revealing not a lobby, but the private entrance to a breathtaking apartment that seemed to float among the clouds. Polished marble floors stretched out before them, leading to floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a panoramic view of the glittering city. The air was cool and still, scented faintly with cedar and something else she couldn't place. It was a world of sterile, opulent beauty. "Welcome home," he said, with no trace of irony in his voice. She had walked into a gilded cage, and the door had just locked behind her. The penthouse was less a home and more a monument to wealth and solitude. It was a vast, minimalist space of glass, chrome, and charcoal-gray furniture, so immaculate it felt as though no one actually lived there. There were no photographs, no stacks of books, no personal clutter, just a stunning, impersonal view of the city and the suffocating silence. It was the architectural equivalent of the man who owned it, impressive, intimidating, and utterly devoid of warmth. Ava felt like a splash of unwanted color, a chaotic element in his perfectly curated world. Stefan gestured vaguely toward a long, white hallway. Your room is the second door on the left. There are clothes in the closet. My assistant has eclectic taste, but I'm sure you'll find something suitable. He was already shrugging off his tuxedo jacket, his back to her as he walked toward the massive windows, his focus already shifting away from her and back to the empire laid out at his feet. She was a problem that had been temporarily solved, a detail that had been managed. She found the room, a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. A king-size bed with crisp, white duvet dominated the space. A walk-in closet was, as he'd said, filled with designer clothes, tags still attached, in a range of styles and sizes. It was unsettlingly prepared, as if he had anticipated this, as if he kept a collection of women's clothes on hand for just such an occasion. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She felt like a doll being placed in a dollhouse, dressed and positioned for the owner's amusement. She stripped off the borrowed sapphire gown, letting it pool on the floor like a puddle of midnight. In the ensoot bathroom, she washed the makeup from her face, scrubbing at her skin until it was raw, tried to remove the feel of the ballroom, to send the lies. Staring at her reflection in the vast, backlit mirror, she barely recognized a woman looking back at her. The exhaustion was plain to see, but underneath it was a flicker of something else, something hard and resilient that this night had forged. Wrapped in a plush, white robe that felt sinfully soft against her skin, she padded back into the bedroom. She couldn't sleep. Her mind was a torrent of 1,000 anxieties. She walked to a window, which overlooked a different, darker part of the city, a quiet expanse of rooftops and the distant, black ribbon of the river. The forced proximity of their arrangement was beginning to sink in. She was trapped here, in a sterile sanctuary in the sky, bound in by a debt she couldn't repay. The door to her room opened without a knock. Stefan stood in the doorway, having discarded his tie and waistcoat. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the strong, defined muscles there. He looked less like a CEO and more like a predator in his own domain. He held 2 glasses in one hand and a bottle of amber liquid in the other. "I thought you might need this," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He walked in, setting the glasses and bottle down on a small table near the window. He didn't seem to notice, or perhaps didn't care, that she was only in a robe. He poured a measure of whiskey into each glass, the clink of the bottle against the crystal echoing in the stillness. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, small but unmistakable, shot up her arm. He held her gaze for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes searching, analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. The air was thick with everything they weren't saying. He was her captor, but for a fleeting, terrifying second, his eyes held a flicker of something that looked devastatingly like loneliness. Ava took the glass from him, her fingers wrapping around the cool, heavy crystal. She didn't drink whiskey, but she raised it to her lips anyway. The sharp, smoky aroma a jolt to her senses. The silence in the room stretched, no longer empty, but filled with a strange, contemplative weight. He wasn't directing her anymore. He was simply present, a man in a room with a woman, the pretenses of the evening stripped away, leaving something raw and uncertain in their place. He leaned against the far wall, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze fixed on the city below. "Why the bookstore?" he asked, his question so quiet she almost missed it. "You could have chosen 100 other, more profitable ventures. Your father's debt was significant. You must have known it was a losing battle." There was no judgment in his voice, only a detached, analytical curiosity that she found more disarming than any feigned sympathy would have been. He was trying to understand her motivations, to fit her into a box his logical mind could comprehend. "It wasn't a venture," she replied, her voice finding a surprising strength. "And it wasn't a battle. It was his life. It's the smell of old books and chamomile tea. It's the creak of the 3rd floorboard from the left. It's the place where I learned to read, where he taught me the names of every flower." She took a small, hesitant sip of the whiskey. It burned, a clean, searing heat that traveled down her throat and settled deep in her chest. "Some things are worth more than their profit margin, Mr. Morris." He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "My father built his empire on the belief that nothing was worth more than his profit margin," he said, his voice flat and hard, like slate. He saw emotion as a liability, a fatal flaw in the machinery of success. He pushed himself off the wall and walked to the window, standing beside her, though he kept a careful distance between them. Together, they looked out at the silent, sprawling city, two strangers bound by a contract, sharing a moment of unexpected truth. She risked a glance at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw and the shadows that clung to him like a second skin. She saw not the ruthless CEO from the news reports, but a man shaped by an absence of warmth, a man who had been taught to measure the world in numbers. It was a fleeting, dangerous glimpse into the architecture of his loneliness, and it stirred something in her she wasn't prepared for, an unwelcome, treacherous flicker of empathy. He turned his head slightly, his blue eyes meeting hers. The analytical glint was gone, replaced by something deeper, something unguarded. "He would despise your bookstore, Ava," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And for that reason alone, I'm glad you're going to save it." It was the closest he had come to saying something genuinely kind, a sentiment so unexpected it felt like a crack in the very foundation of the man she thought he was. He reached out, not to touch her, but to run a single finger along the condensation trail on the outside of her glass. The gesture was slow, deliberate, his knuckle brushing against her skin for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a spark of heat in the cool, sterile room. He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer before pulling his hand back, the moment broken. He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. "Get some sleep," he said without looking back. "Tomorrow will be a long day." As the door clicked shut behind him, she realized she was no longer afraid of his power, but the man hidden beneath it. Ava woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight streaming through a gap in automated blackout curtains. The silence of the penthouse a stark contrast to familiar morning sounds in her own neighborhood. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memories of the gala, the balcony, and the cold, heavy weight of the diamond ring came rushing back. The events of the previous night felt like a surreal fever dream, but the expensive, unfamiliar robe she was wearing was proof that it had all been real. She found Stefan in the kitchen, a sleek, sterile expanse of stainless steel and white marble. He was already dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, a stark white shirt emphasizing the powerful lines of his athletic form. He stood by the counter, a tablet in one hand, a mug of black coffee in the other, his focus absolute. He was on a call, his voice sharp, decisive, and utterly devoid of emotion as he dismantled someone's argument on the other end of the line. That's not an obstacle. It's a failure of imagination. Fix it. He ended the call without a goodbye. He looked up as she entered, his gaze sweeping over her, his expression neutral. The brief, vulnerable connection they had shared over whiskey seemed to have evaporated with the morning light. He was once again Stephen Morris, the ruthless CEO, and she was once again a component in his elaborate strategy. "Good morning," he said, his tone brisk. "There's coffee. We have a car coming at 11. We're attending a fundraising luncheon for the city's botanical gardens." It was an order, not an invitation. A small surge of rebellion went through her. "You don't get to just schedule my life," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "I have things to do, my own life to manage." He raised a single, unimpressed eyebrow. "Your life, for the next 36 hours, is whatever I say it is. This is part of the deal, Ms. Johnson. Or have you forgotten the 250,000 reasons why you're here?" His words were a cold, brutal reminder of her position. He gestured with his chin toward a thin, leather-bound folder on the marble island. "That's for you. It contains everything you need to know for today. The guest list, key talking points about the charity, and a few more refined details about our backstory." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes watching her over the rim of the mug, gauging her reaction. The cold, calculating nature of his planning was both terrifying and, in a strange way, impressive. He left nothing to chance. Ava opened the folder, her fingers tracing the embossed logo of his company. Inside, typed on crisp, heavy bond paper, was a detailed summary of their fictitious life. It listed fake favorite restaurants, a made-up first date story, even the name of the non-existent puppy they were planning to adopt. It was a chillingly complete fabrication of a life they had never lived, a romance that had never been. She felt a wave of nausea as she read through the meticulously crafted lies. Then her breath caught. Tucked away in a section labeled Personal Aspirations was a single sentence that made her blood run cold. It described her supposed lifelong dream: to create a community floral studio, a therapeutic program offering free workshops to underprivileged children in the city's poorest neighborhoods. It was a secret, deeply cherished hope she had nurtured for years, a dream she had never spoken aloud to a single soul. How could he possibly know? It was no longer just a lie. It was an invasion, and she had to know how he had seen into her heart. The charity luncheon was held in a glass conservatory, a stunning structure of iron and light where exotic flowers and lush greenery climbed the walls. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. It was a world Ava understood, a language of petals and leaves she was fluent in, yet surrounded by the city's most powerful figures. She felt more out of place than ever. Dressed in an elegant cream-colored silk dress from Stefan's curated closet, she felt like one of the hothouse flowers, beautiful, cultivated, and completely removed from her natural environment. Stefan's hand was a constant, warm presence on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowded room. He was a master of this environment, moving with a calm, predatory confidence, exchanging pleasantries that were laced with unspoken power plays. He introduced her with a practiced ease, his voice laced with subtle pride that was utterly convincing. "This is my fiancée, Ava. She has the most incredible eye for beauty." To her horror, Ava found herself blushing under his feigned adoration, the performance becoming dangerously intertwined with confusing, nascent reality. She played her part, smiling demurely, offering anecdotes from their fabricated history. The lies came more easily now, a smooth, polished script she hadn't realized she'd memorized. People seemed charmed by her, by the quiet, unassuming woman who had apparently captured the city's most untouchable bachelor. They saw a love story, a billionaire romance unfolding before their eyes, and they were captivated. Ava, however, saw only the intricate mechanics of a deal, the slow, agonizing burn of her own compromise. As Stefan was pulled into a conversation with a city councilman, a woman with sharp, bird-like features and diamonds dripping from her ears descended upon Ava. "Clarissa Beaumont," she said, her smile not reaching her cold, calculating eyes. "I've known Stefan for years. I must say, darling, you are not at all his usual type." Her voice was sweet as honey, but her words were laced with venom. Clarissa was a known corporate rival, her family's company a direct competitor to Morris Industries. "Oh." Ava kept her expression placid, taking a delicate sip of iced tea. "What is his usual type?" Clarissa's smile widened. "Ambitious, well-connected, women from his own world. He's never been one for charity cases." The insult was direct, a perfectly aimed arrow designed to shatter Ava's composure. For a second, the raw truth of the statement stung, and Ava felt her carefully constructed facade begin to crack. Before she could respond, Stefan was there, appearing as if from nowhere. He slid his arm around Ava's waist, pulling her flush against his side in a gesture of unmistakable possession. "Clarissa," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "How kind of you to take such an interest in my personal life. I didn't realize your own was so dull." He looked down at Ava, his eyes softening in a public display of affection. "Are you all right, darling? I know how much you dislike corporate sharks." He guided her away, leaving a stunned and furious Clarissa in their wake. When they reached a quiet corner near a cascading wall of orchids, he didn't immediately let her go. He leaned in close, his body shielding her from the rest of the room, his breath a warm whisper against her ear. It was a gesture that, to anyone watching, would look like an intimate, loving moment. But his words were not for them. They were only for her. "She's been trying to get under my skin for years," he murmured, his voice a low, rumbling vibration. "Don't let her." Then, a beat later, he added, "For what it's worth, your ability to feign innocence is far more convincing than her ability to feign civility." The sincerity in his unexpected defense sent a confusing warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling dangerously close to being protected. The ride back to the penthouse was steeped in a thick, unnerving silence. The smooth purr of the luxury sedan was the only sound, a low hum against the backdrop of the city slipping past their tinted windows. Ava sat perfectly still, the ghost of Stefan's protective arm still warm around her waist, the echo of his surprising defense of her replaying in her mind. It was a contradiction she couldn't solve. The man who had bought her for the night had just shielded her with an almost primal instinct. He had called her darling for the benefit of their audience, but his quiet reassurance in the corner had felt dangerously real. She risked a glance at him. He was staring out the window, his profile a hard, impassive mask, the chiseled line of his jaw tight with thoughts she couldn't begin to guess. The brief connection at the luncheon, the flicker of a united front, had vanished. He had retreated back into the fortress of himself, leaving her on the outside once again. The whiplash was exhausting, this constant dance between his calculated performance and the rare, startling glimpses of the man beneath it. She felt a growing, desperate need to understand which one was real. The moment they stepped back into the sterile silence of the penthouse, she knew she couldn't let it go. The folder with its fabricated history was still lying on the marble island, a testament to his meticulous planning and his unnerving insight. The lie about their first date was one thing, but a lie about her deepest, most private dream was another entirely. It was a violation that went far beyond the terms of their agreement, and she needed an answer. She needed to know how he had reached into her soul and plucked out a secret she had never shared. As he loosened his tie, his back to her, she finally spoke, her voice clear and steady in the vast, quiet room. "How did you know?" He paused, his hand stilled. "No, what?" he asked, his tone weary, as if he were already dismissing her. She picked up the folder, its leather cool and smooth beneath her trembling fingers. She didn't need to open it. The words were burned into her memory. About the community studio, the workshops for children. How did you know that was my dream? He turned slowly, his expression unreadable, a carefully blank canvas. He gave her the answer she expected, the one that was logical and cold and fit the man he presented to the world. "I had a background check done on you, Ava. A thorough one. It's standard procedure when I bring someone into my life, even under these circumstances. My security team is extremely efficient." He was attempting to frame it as a simple matter of due diligence, a necessary precaution for a man of his stature. But she wouldn't let him hide behind his corporate protocols. She took a step closer, her resolve hardening. "That's not good enough," she insisted, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. "I've never written that down. I've never put it on a loan application. I've never told a single person about it, not even my closest friends. It was a thought, a hope, something I kept for myself. So I'll ask you again, Stefan." Using his first name was a deliberate challenge, a refusal to maintain the professional distance he hid behind. "How did you know?" He held her gaze, a long, silent battle of wills playing out between them. She saw a flicker of something in his piercing blue eyes, not anger, but something closer to resignation. The rigid set of his shoulders seemed to soften almost imperceptibly. "There was an article," he said, his voice quiet, losing its hard, executive edge. "A small, local blog did a piece on legacy businesses a year ago. They interviewed you. Most of it was about your father, about the store. But right at the end, you mentioned it, not as a plan, but as a someday wish." He hadn't just found a piece of data. He had found a piece of her. His admission settled in the space between them, heavier than any of the lies they had told. He hadn't just delegated the task of digging into her life. He had personally sifted to the mundane details and found the one deeply personal thread. The knowledge was both invasive and strangely intimate. He had seen a part of her that she kept hidden from the world, and he had used it, weaving it into the tapestry of their deception. The anger she had expected to feel was there, but was tangled with a confusing, disarming sense of being seen. He seemed to recognize the turmoil in her eyes, because he broke their intense gaze first, turning away with discomfort that felt entirely genuine. It was a crack in his armor of indifference, a sign that her confrontation had unsettled him, It made the narrative more believable, he said, the words sounding like a weak justification even to his own ears. He walked into the kitchen, creating distance, and opened the ridiculously large, stainless steel refrigerator. "Are you hungry?" he asked, the mundane question a desperate attempt to pivot away from the emotional precipice they were standing on. This time, she wouldn't allow the subject to be changed. She followed him, stopping just outside the kitchen island, creating a barrier between them. "Why did you read it, Stefan?" she asked, her voice soft but persistent. "Why were you reading local blog posts about a failing bookstore in the first place?" He pulled out a bottle of water, his movements precise and controlled, but she could see the tension in the line of his back. He was a man who was used to being in complete control, and she was pushing him far beyond the limits of his comfort. He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "Because I needed to know who I was dealing with," he admitted, his voice low and rough. "Not just the financial details. I needed to understand what mattered to you. It's called opposition research. Ava, I do it for every deal, for every person. Your bookstore, it was the one thing in your file that made no logical sense. I needed to know why." He was explaining a business tactic, but it sounded like a confession. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a profound weariness. His world was one of strategies and research, of understanding people's motivations in order to leverage them. And yet he had seen her dream, and instead of weaponizing it, he had protected it in his own strange way. A silent truce seemed to pass between them. "I'm starving," she said, finally answering his earlier question. A faint look of relief crossed his face. He nodded, and for the first time, an air of unscripted domesticity filled the sterile kitchen. He pulled out simple ingredients from the depths of his perfectly organized pantry: a package of pasta, a can of San Marzano tomatoes, a head of garlic, a fresh basil plant still in its pot. Without discussion, they began to cook. Ava chopped the garlic, the familiar, pungent scent of comfort in this alien environment, while Stefan measured out the pasta with surprising, efficient grace. The simple, shared task was more real than anything they had done in the past 24 hours. They ate at the vast, empty dining table. The simple meal of pasta with fresh tomato sauce of stark, wonderful contrast to the performative glamour of the gala and the luncheon. The silence was no longer tense or awkward, but comfortable, filled with the quiet sounds of their meal. She watched him as he ate, the formidable CEO momentarily replaced by a man enjoying a simple plate of food. He seemed younger, less burdened. The slow burn of their forced proximity was beginning to melt away the ice, revealing unexpected layers beneath. She was having dinner with her fake fiancé, and for the first time, she forgot it was all supposed to be an act. Later that night, sleep was an impossibility. Ava lay in the enormous, comfortable bed, the luxurious sheets like cool silk against her skin, but her mind was a whirlwind. The day had been a series of emotional collisions, from the public defense at the luncheon to the private confession in the kitchen. Stefan Morris was a man of infuriating, captivating contradictions. He was a ruthless strategist who read local blogs, a cold billionaire who cooked simple pasta, a captor who had begun to feel terrifyingly like a protector. Giving up on sleep, she slipped out of bed, the plush carpet soft beneath her bare feet. The penthouse was dark and silent, the only light coming from the glittering tapestry of the city below, which spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Drawn by an unseen current, she found herself wandering through the vast, empty spaces, a ghost in his silent castle in the sky. She felt a strange pull toward the one room they hadn't entered, a door at the far end of a long hallway that he seemed to unconsciously avoid. She found the door slightly ajar, a sliver of warm, low light spilling out into the darkened hall. A sound, so faint she almost missed it, emanated from within. The soft, melancholic notes of solo piano, the melody full of a deep, aching sadness. It wasn't stereo. The sound was too rich, too resonant. It was the sound of a real piano being played with a quiet, heartbreaking skill. Curiosity warred with her sense of propriety, and curiosity won. She pushed the door open a few more inches and peeked inside. The room was his study, but it was nothing like the rest of the sterile apartment. It was a sanctuary of warmth and character. Books overflowed from built-in shelves. stacked in untidy piles on the floor. A worn, leather armchair sat beside a reading lamp, and in the center of the room, his back to her, sat Stefan, his broad shoulders hunched over a magnificent grand piano, his fingers moving over the keys with a fluid, unconscious grace. He was the source of the beautiful, sorrowful music. She must have made a small sound, a soft intake of breath, because the music stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening. He didn't turn around immediately, but she saw his posture stiffen, the effortless grace of the musician replaced by the rigid control of the CEO. He was caught in a moment of profound vulnerability, exposed in a way she knew he would despise. She felt a pang of guilt for intruding on this private, hidden part of him. "I didn't know you played," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the stillness of the room. He finally turned on the piano bench to face her, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else, something she couldn't name. It was as if she had walked into the only room in his entire world that was truly his, and he didn't know what to do about it. The hard mask was gone, replaced by an unguarded weariness that made him look devastatingly human. He rose from the bench and walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, with the sad notes of the piano still hanging in the air, with the reality of the situation and the undeniable, magnetic pull that was growing between them. He looked from her eyes, down at her lips, and then back again. The entire world seemed to shrink to the small, charged space between their bodies, a universe of tension and possibility. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her skin for a heartbeat too long. His touch was a brand, a whisper of warmth against her skin that seemed to silence every thought in her head. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, a gesture so gentle and yet so profoundly intimate that it felt more real than the diamond on her finger. For a heartbeat, she forgot the contract, the money, the lies. She was just Ava, and he was just Stefan. Two people standing in a quiet room filled with the ghost of a sad melody, on the verge of something she was terrified to name. His piercing blue eyes held a universe of unspoken things, a raw vulnerability that mirrored the music he'd just played. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the moment shattered. He dropped his hand as if her skin had burned him, taking a half step back, the distance between them once again a chasm. The mask of the controlled, indifferent CO slammed back into place, his expression shuddering, becoming carefully, cruelly blank. "It's late," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, stripped of the warmth of the musician. "You should be in bed." It was a dismissal, a clear and deliberate rebuilding of the walls she had just glimpsed over. Ava couldn't find her voice to respond. 1,000 replies died on her lips. She wanted to ask about the music, about the sadness in his eyes, about the man she had seen for a fleeting, breathtaking moment, but she knew he wouldn't answer. He had shown her a crack in his armor, and now he was sealing it shut, locking her out. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned, walking away from the warmth of the study and back into the cold, empty perfection of the hallway, every step feeling like a retreat. She didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see the closed-off expression that she knew would be on his face. The silence that followed her down the hall was absolute, a profound and heavy emptiness where the beautiful music had been. She felt a deep, aching sense of loss for something she had never really had, a connection that had sparked and been extinguished in the space of a single, lingering touch. It was a painful reminder that this was his world, and she was only a temporary visitor, an actress whose role was almost at an end. Back in the sterile guest room, she slid beneath the cool sheets, but sleep was a distant country. Her skin still tingled where he had touched her. She could still hear the melancholy notes of the piano, a soundtrack to the loneliness she had seen in him, a loneliness that resonated with a forgotten corner of her own heart. He had built his life into a fortress of glass and steel, but she had found the one room with an unlocked door, and what she found inside had changed everything. She replayed the moment again and again in her mind. The way he looked at her, the gentle brush of his fingers, the brief, unguarded honesty in his eyes. He wasn't just a ruthless CEO anymore. He was a man who spoke a language of sorrow through music, a man who had a world of feeling behind walls of his own making. The forced proximity of their arrangement had thrown them together, but this felt different. This was a collision of their true selves, stripped of the pretense. She was no longer just playing a part. She was starting to wish with every fiber of her being that it were real. The next morning, the atmosphere in the penthouse was thick with an awkward, brittle tension. The unspoken events of the previous night hung in the air between them, a ghost at the breakfast table. Stefan was already dressed, a dark, imposing figure in another flawlessly tailored suit, his focus entirely on the financial news streaming on a tablet propped up against a fruit bowl. He was all business, the musician from the study locked away, so completely it felt like he might have been a dream. He didn't look up when she entered the kitchen, but she felt his awareness of her, a subtle stiffening of his shoulders. "Good morning," he said, his voice formal clipped. "There's coffee. My driver will be here at 7 this evening." He finally lifted his gaze from the screen, his eyes cool and distant, betraying nothing of the vulnerability she had seen just hours before. The whiplash was dizzying, leaving her feeling unsteady and foolishly exposed. She had seen behind the curtain, and he was now determined to pretend it didn't exist. "7?" she asked, her voice quiet as she poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands not quite steady. "What's a 7? He took a slow, deliberate sip from his own mug, his eyes holding hers over the rim. "The final act," he said, his tone devoid of any irony. "Mr. Saito and his wife have invited us to a private dinner at the conservatory. It's a formality, a final appraisal before he signs the merger documents tomorrow morning. He wants to see us in a more intimate setting." The words "final act" landed like a physical blow. Of course, this was always a transaction, a performance with a set run time. Tomorrow, the deal would be done, the money would be in her account, and she would walk out his life forever, back to her world of flowers and old books. The thought, which should have been a relief, sent a surprising and unwelcome pang of grief through her. She was a fool. She had let a few shared moments of false intimacy get to her. She had let herself feel something. "After tonight," he continued, his voice a flat, unemotional cadence, "our arrangement is concluded. The funds will be transferred to your account by 9 a.m. You will be free to go." He said it so simply, as if he were discussing the termination of a vendor contract, not the end of the most intense and emotionally charged 2 days of her life. He was giving her what she wanted, what she had agreed to, so why did it feel like he was taking everything? She simply nodded, unable to trust her voice. She turned away, staring out the window at the sprawling city, at the millions of lives being lived completely separate from this strange, gilded cage. She had to get through one more night of this charade. One more night of pretending to be the woman who loved him, a task that was becoming frighteningly, heartbreakingly easy. On the bed in her room, another dress had been laid out, a breathtaking gown of deep emerald silk, elegant and impossibly beautiful. She picked it up, the fabric cool and heavy in her hands. It felt like a costume for a role she no longer knew how to play. She looked at the diamond ring resting on the nightstand, its cold fire seeming to mock her. For 2 days, it had been a symbol of a lie. Now, it felt like a symbol of a future she was only allowed to borrow, a dream she would have to wake up from in the morning. She had to pretend to be his future, just as she was beginning to realize she didn't want a future without him. The conservatory restaurant was an oasis of hushed elegance, a private dining room, enclosed in glass walls that looked out onto a starlit garden. The soft glow of candlelight danced on crystal and silver, and the air was filled with the subtle, intoxicating scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive wine. Mr. Saito was a gracious host, but it was his wife, a kind-eyed woman named Akiko, who was the real threat. Her gaze was warm but impossibly perceptive, and she watched Ava and Stefan with an open, romantic curiosity. Stefan was magnificent. He was a perfect fiancé, attentive and utterly besotted. He held Ava's chair. His hand rested on the small of her back, and when he looked at her, his eyes filled with a warmth so convincing it made her heart ache. He was playing his part, she reminded herself, for the final time. But as the evening wore on, the lines between performance and reality blurred into an indistinguishable haze. Every touch, every shared glance, felt charged with the unspoken truths of the past 2 days. "You two just glow with happiness," Akiko said, her smile genuine. "Stefan, I have never seen you look so at peace." She turned her warm gaze to Ava. "He has always been so driven, so focused. You are clearly a wonderful influence on him." Ava murmured a polite, self-deprecating response, the words feeling like dust in her mouth. She could feel Stefan's thumb stroking the back of her hand where it rested on the table, a small, possessive gesture that sent a jolt of heat straight through her. The true test came during dessert. Akiko leaned forward slightly, her expression soft. "Forgive me for being a hopeless romantic," she said, "but I must ask, Stefan, what was the moment you knew you loved her?" The question hung in the air, a beautiful, terrifying trap. The entire multi-billion-dollar merger seemed to balance on his answer. Ava held her breath, her own heart hammering against her ribs, desperate and terrified to hear the lie he would invent. Stefan didn't hesitate. He turned to Ava, his gaze so intense it felt like he was looking directly into her soul. He didn't look at the Saidos. He looked only at her. "It wasn't one moment," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble that vibrated through the table. "It was 100 small ones. It was the way she talks about flowers, as if they're people. It's the fierce, stubborn loyalty she has to the things she loves. It was when I realized," he paused, his voice dropping even lower, "that her quiet strength was greater than any power I had ever built." His eyes held hers, and in their piercing blue depths, she saw no deception. The words, so specific and so true, shattered her. He had taken things he had learned about her passion, her fight for the bookstore, and woven them into the most beautiful declaration she had ever heard. It was a lie, a perfect, calculated lie designed to win a deal, but it was built on a foundation of pure truth. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. He gently reached up and brushed it away with his thumb, his touch impossibly tender. Mr. and Mrs. Saito exchanged a knowing, delighted look. The deal was sealed. Later, as their car pulled away from the restaurant, the silence between them was different. It wasn't awkward or tense, but heavy with the weight of his words. His hand, which had found hers during the dinner, was still holding it, his fingers laced through hers. He made no move to pull away. He simply sat there, holding her hand, staring out the window at the passing city lights, his thumb continuing to make slow, soothing circles on her skin. He looked down at their joined hands, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, he looked as if he never wanted to let go. The silence in the car on the way back to the penthouse was a living thing. It was no longer the awkward, brittle tension of the morning, but a dense, profound stillness, thick with the echoes of his words at dinner. His hand was still laced through hers, a warm, solid presence in the cool, dark interior of the car. He made no move to release her, and she made no move to pull away. It was a silent, mutual agreement to prolong the illusion, to exist for a few more minutes in this fragile reality they had created. Ava stared out the window, but she didn't see the glittering city lights. She saw the look in his eyes when he'd spoken of her loyalty, the gentle way he'd brushed away her tear. It was the most masterful performance she had ever witnessed, and yet it was the one moment that had felt unequivocally true. The slow burn of their forced proximity had finally ignited into something she had no name for, a feeling that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. She was an actress who had fallen in love with the character she was playing, and even worse, with a man who had written the script. The car purred to a stop in the private underground garage. The driver, a discreet shadow, opened the door, and the spell was momentarily broken. But as Stefan stepped out, he held on to her hand, helping her from the car and keeping their fingers intertwined as they walked to the private elevator. Every step echoed in the cavernous, silent space. The finality of the evening loomed over them. The deal was done. The performance was over. And in a few short hours, she would be gone. The elevator ride up was a slow, silent ascent into the clouds, the city shrinking below them. He still hadn't let go of her hand. He stood beside her, not looking at her, but staring straight ahead at their reflections in the polished bronze doors. She saw them standing there, a striking couple in their elegant evening wear, their hands clasped between them. They looked perfect. They looked real. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking lie, and the clock was ticking toward its expiration. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, which was dark except for the ambient glow of the city lights pouring through the massive windows. He walked her to the door of her guest room, the same door he had closed between them the night before. This felt different. This was not a dismissal. This was a crossroads. He finally released her hand, and the sudden absence of his warmth was a physical ache. He stood before her, the powerful CEO, the lonely musician, the fake fiancé, all warring in his piercing blue eyes. The silence stretched, filled with all the things they had never said, with the music from his study and the taste of the cheap pasta they had shared. He had built a fortress around his heart, and for 2 days she had been a willing prisoner within its walls. Now, the gate was open, and she was supposed to walk out without a backward glance. But her feet felt rooted to the floor, held there by the invisible, powerful gravity of the man standing before her. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, as if the words themselves were a betrayal of a lifetime of control. He stood there, silhouetted against a glittering city, a man locked in a silent, internal war. The rigid control he maintained so fiercely was visibly cracking, the carefully constructed walls of his composure beginning to crumble. Ava could see the battle in the tight line of his jaw, in the conflicted darkness of his eyes. He wanted to send her away, to reset the world to the simple, transactional terms of their agreement. But the heart, she was learning, does not obey the logic of a business deal. Ava, he finally said, his voice rough, raw, the sound of a man unaccustomed to surrender. He took a half step closer, closing the small, safe distance between them. Tonight, at dinner, what I said about why He trailed off, struggling with the words, with an admission that went against every instinct he possessed. It wasn't just for Saito. It wasn't all a lie. The confession hung in the air, a fragile, beautiful truth in a world built of deceptions. His gaze was intense, searching, pleading with her to understand something he didn't know how to say. I have spent my entire life quantifying the world, he continued, his voice barely a whisper, measuring people's worth, their assets, their liabilities. I saw you as the solution, a means to an end. He shook his head, a small, frustrated gesture. But you're not a liability. You're not an asset. You're a force of nature. You fight for what you love with a quiet ferocity that I've never seen. He was finally letting her in, showing her the man behind the ruthless facade, the man she had glimpsed in the study. This started as a contract, he admitted, his voice laced with bewildered awe. It was supposed to be simple. But nothing about you is simple. He looked lost, adrift in an emotional landscape he had never before navigated, the formidable billionaire utterly undone by a florist from a world he had never known. He was a man who commanded empires, and he was terrified of the feeling that was commanding him now. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them for a long, hesitant moment before his fingers came to rest gently on her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a feather-light touch that sent a tremor through her entire body. The guarded, analytical storm in his eyes had cleared, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability that took her breath away. He was giving her all the broken, beautiful pieces of himself without a single defense left. He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. She could feel his breath, warm and unsteady, against her lips. The clean, sharp scent of him filled her senses, intoxicating and familiar. The space between them was electric, charged with 2 days of unspoken tension, of forced proximity that ignited a slow burn into an inferno. The penthouse, the city, the contract, it all melted away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in this single, perfect, terrifying moment. His eyes were asking a question his lips didn't dare to form, a silent, desperate plea for her to be the one to close the final distance. In the end, it was her choice. She could step back, accept the end of their arrangement, and walk away with her life irrevocably changed, her father's legacy secured. Or she could step forward, into the terrifying, uncharted territory of his heart. She saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of a man who had never allowed himself to need anyone, and her own fear simply fell away. This was not about a contract anymore. This was about the man who played sad songs on a grand piano in a lonely room. She raised her hands, her palms coming to rest on the crisp fabric of his suit jacket, feeling the frantic, steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. Then she slowly moved one hand up, her fingers threading into his short blonde hair, the other cupping his jaw, her thumb brushing against the rough stubble there. She felt a shudder go through him at her touch, a deep, primal surrender. He didn't move, didn't breathe, giving her all the power. She closed a final inch between them. The kiss was not the fiery, demanding collision she might have expected from a man like him. It was a question, a soft, tentative exploration that was achingly gentle. It was a kiss of profound relief, a sigh of two souls who had been circling each other in a storm and had finally found a safe harbor. It was full of the unspoken tension of the gala, the shared intimacy of a simple pasta dinner, and the heart-stopping vulnerability of a sad melody in the dark. He responded with a low groan, a sound that rumbled deep in his chest. His arms came around her, one hand sliding to the small of her back, the other cradling her head, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. The kiss deepened, becoming a slow, searing exchange of every emotion they had suppressed for the past 48 hours. It was a kiss of discovery, of learning the shape and taste of each other, a silent conversation more honest than any words they had ever spoken. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, foreheads still resting against each other. The world had irrevocably shifted on its axis. The line between what was fake and what was real had been completely and beautifully obliterated. He had started this by whispering a command into her ear in a crowded ballroom, and now, in the silent intimacy of the hallway, he was whispering her name, over and over, as if it were a prayer. He looked at her, his eyes dark with emotion so deep it was bottomless. There was no strategy left in his gaze, no calculation, only a raw and reverent awe. He had built an empire, conquered boardrooms, and bent the world to his will. But the quiet strength of one woman had brought him to his knees without a single fight. The contract had forced them together, but it was their hearts that had sealed a deal of their own. He whispered her name one last time, a sound of both reverence and beautiful, absolute ruin. The next morning, Ava woke slowly, tangled in sheets that smelled of cedar and him. Sunlight was streaming into the room, painting golden stripes across the floor. For a blissful, disoriented moment, she allowed herself to believe this was real, that she had woken up in a life where she belonged in his arms. But as her mind cleared, a cold dread began to seep into her bones. The bed beside her was empty. The warmth of his body was gone, leaving only a faint indentation on the pillow. A wave of panic, sharp and sickening, washed over her. Had it all been a dream? Had the kiss, the confession, the raw emotion in his eyes been a figment of her own desperate imagination? She scrambled out of bed, pulling the soft, white robe around herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. The penthouse was silent, the stillness feeling ominous now instead of peaceful. The magic of the night had vanished with the dawn, leaving only the harsh, cold light of reality. She found him in the living room, standing in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city as it woke up below. He wasn't in a suit. He was dressed in a simple, dark gray t-shirt and trousers, the casual clothes making him seem both younger and more intimidatingly real. He hadn't slept. She could see the exhaustion in the rigid set of his shoulders, the tension in the line of his back. He was staring at the sunrise, but he wasn't seeing its beauty. He was seeing the end of a deadline. He must have heard her, because he turned, his expression unreadable, a mask of careful neutrality firmly back in place. The unguarded man who had kissed her with such desperate tenderness was gone, replaced once again by the formidable CEO. The sight of it was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. "Good morning," he said, his voice quiet, formal, creating a distance that felt like a slap in the face. She couldn't speak. She just stood there, clutching the robe tighter around herself, searching his face for any sign of the man from last night, any flicker of the emotion they had shared. But his eyes were guarded, his face a carefully blank slate. He was shutting her out again, retreating behind the impenetrable walls of his fortress. This time, it was infinitely more painful because she knew now what it felt like to be on the inside. He glanced at the sleek, minimalist clock on the wall, its digital numbers glowing red. 8:59 a.m. The sun had fully risen, flooding the penthouse with bright, unforgiving light, leaving no room for shadows or secrets. The spell was broken. The fairy tale was over. He looked from the clock back to her, and his piercing blue eyes were filled with a deep, profound regret. "Ava," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion, "the money has been transferred. Our agreement is over." His words were a perfectly executed severance, clean and final, cutting the last thread that bound them together. The finality of his statement hung in the air, as cold and sterile as the penthouse itself. The agreement was over. The $250,000, the price of her dignity and the salvation of her dreams, was now sitting in her bank account. He had fulfilled his end of the bargain with the same ruthless efficiency with which he ran his empire. She was free to walk away, to return to her life, to save her bookstore. It was everything she had wanted 2 days ago. So why did it feel like she was losing everything that mattered? He stood there, a powerful, solitary figure against the morning light, offering her a clean escape. "You're free to go, Ava." This was a deal. He was forcing them back to the beginning, back to the cold, hard lines of their contract, perhaps to protect himself, or perhaps to protect her. Or maybe he truly believed this was all it could ever be, a transaction, a beautifully executed, emotionally devastating transaction. This was her final test, a choice that had nothing in common with money and everything to do with the truth of what had happened between them. She looked at him, at the billionaire who had tried to buy a piece of her life, and all she could see was a lonely man who hid his sorrow in the keys of a piano. The ruthless CEO who had whispered, "Tonight, you're my fake fiancé," in a crowded gala now stood before her, offering her a fortune to disappear. But the question was no longer about a fake fiancé. It was about a real future, with a heart that felt like it was breaking into a million pieces. She turned and walked toward the door. Each step was an agony, a silent surrender to the terms he had set. She could feel his eyes on her back, watching her go. She imagined the relief and the regret warring on his face. She reached the door, her hand resting on the cold, steel handle, the final barrier between this unbelievable world and her own. This was it, the end of the story. But it wasn't. She stopped, her hand frozen on the knob. She had fought for her father's bookstore with a stubborn loyalty he himself had admired. She couldn't walk away from this without a fight. She had come too far and felt too much to simply accept this cold, transactional ending. Slowly, she turned back to face him. He hadn't moved, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a desperate, fading hope. "The agreement is over," she said, her voice shaking but finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You bought my time and you paid for it. That deal is done." She took a step back toward him, away from the door, away from the escape he was offering her. She closed the distance between them, standing before him not as an employee, but as an equal. "But what about us, Stefan?" He ignored the ruthless CEO. But what should she do with a man? Let us know in the comments if you think she should walk away or fight for him. And don't forget to subscribe for more.